I am more or less an amateur photographer, specializing in landscape and panoramic pictures. I don't know when or how someone is touted to be a professional in my craft, but I have never applied that badge to myself. I have been at this now for well over 25 years, and many of my pictures are posted online at sites such as Flickr. My wife, Sandra, and I were just coming off some high ground, working our way down and through Lower Crab Meadows. I had just set the tripod up with the view of the valley and the trees within the meadows in the foreground, and with Mount Russell rising up in the background. Having taken a few really nice shots from this perspective, the two of us continued to hike through the crab, as we call it. As we made our way through, we had decided to work our way up to a slightly higher position on one of the wooded hilltops to our left side. We had hiked up through the trees to a slightly higher elevation where the perspective through the lens had changed dramatically. Once again, I had set up the tripod to take a few more shots. The view from here was spectacular. I was standing alongside of the camera, setting up for a panoramic shot, when a loud knocking sound emanated through the valley. Sandra and I both looked at each other, as if to say, "What the heck was that?" We began to scan the surrounding area in hopes of seeing whatever had made the sound. I should mention that we hadn't seen any large animals as we passed through the crab, getting to the point where we found ourselves. I was using the telephoto camera lens, and Sandra was using a pair of field glasses to scan the entire area around us. After a few more moments, having heard nothing more, my wife said she saw something dark pacing around in the timber on the slope to our right-hand side. I said to her, "What do you mean, pacing?" She said to me that whatever she was looking at was standing on two legs and was moving back and forth in a random manner within the trees. I immediately started scanning the area in which she was looking with my telephoto, and bingo! There, before my eyes, was a large black Bigfoot on the slope. Just so you can visualize what I was seeing through the lens, the creature was about 2 inches tall in the lens at this distance. I had it in focus though, but I couldn't see it or its movements with great clarity. It was pacing around, exactly as my wife had said, flipping its arms left and right, like a nervous man waiting for a late bus. It stayed in this one small area, pacing around for maybe 10 minutes or so. Suddenly, it stopped pacing and stood erect, facing the north with its head held high, and brought its hands up to its mouth. We once again heard a loud, resonating knock. As soon as we heard the knocking sound, it lowered its arms and started pacing around, as it had been doing before. Now, I must be upfront with you, and whatnot. My wife and I have seen every Bigfoot show available to mankind 10 times and over. We had heard all of these tales and seen all the people pounding on trees with logs and bats walking through the forest. The two of us, in all of our outdoor adventures, have seen and heard nothing for ourselves up until this afternoon of which I speak. On that afternoon, I believe we settled the score once and for all. As far as wood knocks go, it is not a wood knock at all, but rather a large and loud vocalization being made by the creatures internally. Having tried it for myself, I can make a cluck or a knock sound by putting my tongue to the roof of my mouth and moving my jaw downward. There is no way for me to describe the mechanics of what I am talking about to you, but I can do it. Whether or not they are doing it in the same way as something which you and I have no way of knowing. But what I saw and heard was evidence enough for me. There was nothing else present in the valley with us, and the sound occurred exactly when it had elevated its head and put its hands to the sides of its mouth. The creature was evidently very tall and broad in stature. Exactly how big I cannot say, because the distance was far too great and we weren't going over there to say hello. We could most definitely make out the exceedingly long arm length, and its fur or hair was shiny and black. After about what must have been 20 or so minutes, it abruptly stopped this pacing and moved out of our sight, walking what I would say was some 300 or 400 yards. I, as a photographer, have captured some moments in time that will never be duplicated again. I have shown the same stills to many others that you have seen, and they frankly don't believe it or have little or nothing to say about them. I guess it's just part of human nature. We have the believers and the non-believers. We have those who do and those who don't. As for Sandra and myself, we are most definitely now counted among the believers. It was in June of 2011 that Lyle and I were stretching our legs on the shoreline about 20 miles south of Cape Flattery and maybe 10 miles due east of the Olympic National Park. You can get very close to the shore here via the highway, and we were hiking below a short bluff, which is inclusive of a protective narrow band of wildlife management zone. The time of day was roughly 7:30 in the morning when we began our hike. There is a large stretch of shoreline consisting of many miles which Lyle and I regularly hike at different points and times of the year. Lyle is an artist and comes here to collect driftwood to use in his sculptures. We were hugging the bluff, scavenging through the debris from high tide, looking for some good finds, when we were just approaching a bend in the bluff to our left. Once around this bend, a long stretch of beach comes into view, which extends for many miles to the south. As soon as our eyes were clear of the bluff, we could see two large, darkly colored figures moving around a large mass lying on the shore. One of the figures was standing and the other appeared to be down on the ground, moving around. From the distance, it looked like it may have been two men wearing coveralls or even foul weather gear. So we continued, heading in their direction. I don't think we walked another 100 feet when the guy on the ground stood up and the man who was standing turned around quickly to look in our direction. No sooner had this happened than the two of them took off, scurrying up the side of the bluff and out of sight. The whole entire thing was very bizarre as it unfolded before my eyes. As weird as all this may sound to you, picture us walking down this lonely stretch of shore and having this occur before your very own eyes. We continued to walk down to where they had been, and as we got closer, we could see now that the mass on the beach was, in fact, a dead juvenile gray whale. The whale was obviously dead and had enormous wounds on its sides. To us, it appeared to be the result of what may have been a great white, or perhaps a killer whale at most. It appeared to have died and washed up on the beach before being eaten. I now realize, standing over the whale, that what I was seeing from the distance was one guy holding up the upper jaw of the whale, and the other guy was on the ground doing something within the mouth area of the whale. There was a lot of meat, for lack of a better word, and this debris laying around the mouth of this whale on the beach. It seemed as though they had been going through the mouth to harvest the interior of the whale. As we stood there, taking this all in and trying to make sense of it, our eyes now turned to the bluff where the figures had exited. It was fairly tall and steep, and we could see where they had climbed up it. We looked it over and determined that neither of us thought we could scale it all, let alone at a fast pace. These two guys had made it up in just a matter of seconds. Moving closer to the bluff's base, our eyes were open to what we had been seeing. There were several very large, well-made bare footprints at the base of the bluff. They were similar to a human's, but extremely large and broad in nature. The two of us, not being ignorant, now realized we had just seen two Bigfoot scavenging a whale carcass and making a hasty exit up the bluff. With the Olympic National Park and forest being in reasonable close proximity to our location, and the fact of the matter being that there is nothing around here to speak of to begin with, we now knew that they were in the area. The picture had now come together as to what we were seeing. I know, speaking for myself, that I was thinking, what the heck are two guys doing out here in black fisherman's rain gear? And even if they were coveralls, they would be inappropriate for the day's conditions, which were very mild at most. I did notice that as they started to run, their movements looked very strange. Their steps and arm swings looked disproportionate in comparison to what we were used to seeing from a human perspective. Now we know the reason why. We had just seen two Bigfoot on the shore. I feel it would be good to lay down a little groundwork as to who I am and what I do. It may help to add credence to what I'm about to say to both you and everybody out there listening. First of all, I am a third-generation grocer and now food wholesaler. This business, which I now run and own, was started as a grocery store in New York in 1905. Today, having taken over the business many years ago from my father, we are strictly a wholesale vegetable distributor to the restaurant and food service industry, predominantly in New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey. I have a great managerial and employee base that affords me a surplus of free time, with me being able to accomplish most of what I do via phone and internet. Since I don't really need to be there, except for the occasional fly-in, I have lived in numerous locations throughout the country over the past 20 years or so. I am currently in Washington State. In preparation to talk, I was trying to settle on a number in my mind as to how many days I have spent in the woods hunting. To the best of my knowledge, I came up with somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 days on the hunt. This would be inclusive of both small and large game, including waterfowl and 8 safaris. I am reasonably proficient in the disciplines of rifle, shotgun, and bow, and consider myself at this point in the game a decent tracker as well. I've seen a Bigfoot, but that's not why I really wanted to talk to you. I called about some evidence that I've found and a little experiment that I did in hopes of furthering the cause of Bigfoot being real. It's not that I need anyone to convince me. You understand. In the fall of 2006, while stalking some deer in the fringes of the Pasayten Wilderness, I had a large Bigfoot pass above my position on a hillside while I was on the hunt below. As I said, I am not here to speak of this sighting because I frankly don't have much to say about it. I saw it, and it was the real deal, and that's it. What I do want to talk about is this subsequent bone pile that I came across and my experimentation regarding it. In 2008, I was stalking in the area of Henry M. Jackson Wilderness, west of Chelan, when I came into the area that was devoid of, shall I say, all warm-blooded animals. It must have been for well over a mile before I realized that there was absolutely no creatures, be they great or small, to be found in this area. A fact that was extremely unusual in and of itself. A short time later, I came upon what I will describe as a small clearing which was scattered with the bones of just about everything that lives in these parts. I'm talking from skulls to legs and everything in between. Now, it's not that I stood there counting or anything like that, but there were so many bones from so many different animals that it would be impossible to determine what belonged to what. Just so you understand, if you were to shoot a deer in the woods and leave it be, in 6 months' time, there would be zero trace of an animal's body left. In fact, it is my opinion that the skull is the last thing to go because that is virtually the only thing I ever find when hunting. Perhaps there is less marrow in the skull, but other than that, I really don't know why. Regardless, the fact that all these bones were here and there was no wildlife around really got my attention. I decided to do some experiments in the area over the next year or so. It was some 3 months later that I came to this area again and took down a deer about 2 miles away from this bone pile. Now, what I did was not right as it pertains to hunting, but this was an experiment, and for just this one time, I broke all the rules. I shot the deer and left it in the woods so that I could come back to it over time and log what happens to its carcass. I had seen a show about a place called the Body Farm many years ago. This is an outdoor forensics laboratory where human donor bodies were allowed to remain in various states outside in order to determine the rates of decomposition under a variety of circumstances. This study would then better enable law enforcement to determine the time of death for bodies found buried, lying in the woods, or even in the trunks of cars for that matter. Just so you guys know, you could look up the same documentary he's talking about if you go to YouTube and look up The Body Farm. As far as the deer was concerned, and my inability to come in here every day, I had determined that somewhere between 4 and 6 months was needed for this deer to vanish without so much as a trace. There was probably nothing left, and this had happened less than 2 miles away from the bone pile, which was still there and untouched. I must also mention that any hunter worth their salt will tell you that no predatory animal, be they bear, lion, wolf, fox, coyote, or anything else, will take their kill back to the same location over and over again. Whatever they don't eat will be eaten by something else fairly quickly. Having done my little experiment only 2 miles from the site of the bone pile, I went back and set up 3 game cameras in low and high positions near the pile and left them for a month. When I went back in and retrieved the cameras, not so much as one picture had been taken. I reset the area and came back a month later, finding 2 of the cameras missing and one smashed on the ground. It looked like it was hit from the front side with what I will describe as a punch. I say this because there was no damage, such as a rock or log would have done, to the plastic that was visible to my eyes. I took the camera home and disassembled it on my workbench in hopes of salvaging the card. Thankfully, the card was unaffected by the assault. When I reviewed the card, there were 2 pictures. In the first image, I saw what appeared to be dark fingers or a hand that must have come from the side into view, but it was very fuzzy. The second image was completely dark, as though the lens was facing or being held against something dark in color, and that was it. After having performed my experiments, my own personal conviction is this: the bone pile is a place where a Bigfoot is returning to over and over again, to eat. For what reason, I do not know. Secondly, the animals in the area surrounding this place will have nothing to do with this creature had touched, steering clear of the entire area for quite some distance. Again, the reason for this being a mystery at the time. It's also rather remarkable that as I came into the area for the first time, it was at about a mile away that all life was seemingly gone in the woods, and yet at 2 miles distance my deer had completely consumed. This made it clear to me that the Bigfoot's saliva on these bones, or something about it, had created a large barrier of some sort around its kill. At least one thing is clear in my mind now: nothing in the forest wants anything to do with Bigfoot. Within any other species, animals will contend for another's kill. If nothing else, they will return to get their fill of what another may have left behind. My wife Edna and I had started our hike from the Sead Valley and were working our way up north into the Rogue River, Siskiyou National Forest, our destination being the Red Buttes Wilderness area. Edna and I had been through this area many times and knew it probably better or as well as anyone on the planet. We had started early and made our way into what we refer as the Red Zone by noon. We were sitting side by side on a log with our backs to a tree line, facing a small field. We had been sitting quietly for about 20 minutes, taking our lunch break, when we heard something momentarily rustling behind us and off to our left in the trees. I turned my head to look and saw nothing. My wife had done the same thing as we continued to eat. I don't mean to sound like hearing something rustling is any big deal, as there is so much wildlife in here, but every noise does and should get your attention when hiking. The 2 of us have stumbled across many a bear and even a cougar during our many hikes. A few minutes later, as I was pulling my nasal inhaler out of my pocket, we heard what sounded like a loud crack, followed by the sound of a tree dragging on the ground. At least that's what I thought at the time. The 2 of us stood up from our seat on the log and turned to face the woods in the direction of the noise, with the trees being maybe 75 feet at best in front of us. From the position we were in, you couldn't really see into the trees to our left or to our right-hand side, but there was a small opening directly in front of us. We continued to look and listen as the sound of something dragging seemed to be getting closer and louder. Suddenly, a Bigfoot appeared from behind the trees to our right, walking into this opening and dragging a small tree in its right hand. As soon as it had made its way past the barrier of trees and into the opening, it turned its face to look at us and dropped the tree that was in its hand. Turning to the right, it slowly started to walk towards the rear of the opening, retreating back into the woods. It craned its neck, looking back at us as it walked away before it completely disappeared from view. I don't think it was but 5 minutes after we had seen it that we moved forward to where it had dropped the tree. Edna and I stood there looking at the tree. It was dead, but considerably large to be dragging around. It must have been easily 30 feet long and was about 6 inches in diameter at the base. Why this creature was dragging this particular tree and to where is anyone's guess. Our own thoughts being at the time that it couldn't have been planning to take it very far, or else it would have grabbed another tree nearer to that location. It must have been going to or living somewhere in close proximity to where we were standing. I'm sure that this Bigfoot was surprised to see us as we were to see it, perhaps even more so. I say this because we had a fair warning, having heard it coming. To me, there was absolutely no fear exhibited by the beast when I saw it, or having it seen us. Having seen the size of it, the reason why is more than evident. We had a more than perfect view of it for some 30 seconds or more, and when we walked over to the tree it had been dragging, there were several bows that we had watched it pass behind as it walked, all of which were in the neighborhood of 8 to 9 feet off the ground. This was one big mother, and I could tell you that. It appeared to be almost jet black with some red highlights that were shining in the sunlight as it broke into the small clearing. From the side, it seemed to be about 3 feet thick from front to back, and its fingers on the left hand were hanging just below knee level. One of the oddities about it was that the head looked tiny for the body. Now, don't get me wrong, the musculature was immense in every sense of the word, but even at that, the head seemed relatively small. We couldn't really make out any muscular definition other than that everywhere you looked, the body seemed to be bulging outward, such as the chest and the back. It was quite obviously built strongly to the extreme. It was casually walking, holding this tree in one hand that, even dead, had to weigh at least a couple 100 pounds or more, not including the bulkiness of it just being a 30-foot tree. The other thing about the sighting, which I can't forget, is the leisurely way in which, after it had seen us, it walked away. There was absolutely no sense of fear or urgency on its part after having seen us. I guess it knows that it could tear us limb from limb if it had to. And at any rate, that was our sighting, and we call it the Red Butte's Beast, as we named him. My friend and coworker, Roberto, and I were doing a 4-day hike through a national park in Virginia, and I won't name the national park. Along this Appalachian Trail, there are actually some accommodations in place for the weary hikers. Now remember, I'm really scared about what happened here, so I don't want people to come here and attract people to come and try to find a Bigfoot in this place. There are small, locked trailside cabins which can be reserved in advance, located in several locations. They contain bunks, mattresses, blankets, cooking utensils, and many other necessities. In addition, there are many 3-sided shelters in which there are bunks and outdoor fireplace for warmth and cooking. It is relative to one of these 3-sided structures that our story will unfold. Now, these 3-sided shelters are a shared commodity. In other words, if you are in there and a couple of other hikers come along to crash for the night, you are obligated to welcome them in and make the best of it. Everyone deserves shelter for the night, and it may be many miles before coming across another one on the trail. So Roberto and I, having planned to make it this certain shelter for the night, had arrived at this location, finding it already occupied by a husband and a wife. Having made all of our apologies for having nowhere else to crash for the night, they said that there are no apologies needed. In fact, they said, "We are rather happy that you came by because some strange happenings have been going on here, and we weren't looking forward to being here alone tonight." Naturally, the question arose, what exactly are the strange happenings in which you speak? Before I continue, let me say that these are in fact 3-sided shelters. They have a roof with 2 sides and a back, and one side being completely open to whoever and whatever may come along. We were, by the way, spending the night in the shelter by Loft Mountain. The couple went on to tell us that some 2 years ago, a group of 4 hikers was doing exactly what we were doing, just south of us in a shelter by Big Flat Mountain. Upon awaking in the morning, one of the group of 4 was no longer in the shelter. Her backpack was left behind. The couple went on to say that over a period of days, a large search had been undertaken for the missing girl that came up empty. It was some several weeks later, near the border of West Virginia, many miles away from the location of the disappearance, that a man walking through the woods came upon the body of the girl draped over the upper limb of a large tree, naked and having been partially dismembered. After they told us this story, I couldn't sleep a wink during the night. In the morning, as we got about the busyness of resuming our hike, my friend Roberto, who is a half-mad rebel from Central America, gets the boneheaded idea that we should go south and spend the night at the very shelter where this event had taken place only 2 years ago. I told him he was out of his mind, but after much back and forth about it being a freaky thing to do, of this and that, I had succumbed to the plan, and off we went. Having arrived there, it was basically a duplicate of where we had been the last night. Only this night, he and I were alone. As the sun set and the evening turned into the night, I had basically been up for well over 24 hours, having not slept at all during the night. To be quite honest with you, I wasn't too keen on falling asleep there that night. It must have been around midnight when I looked at Roberto and he was sound asleep. This guy could fall asleep during a blizzard sitting on a curb, and yet I was still awake. It wasn't just that we had heard the story about what happened here, but to me there was most certainly some type of creepy residual aspect about being here. I was uncomfortable the entire night, feeling as though we were being watched very closely. By whom or what, I can't tell you, but I just couldn't shake it. Speaking for myself, the sun couldn't come up soon enough, and I was sorry that I had listened to Roberto's rant about wanting to come here. He was asleep, and I was being mentally tortured for the entire night in the shelter. Nothing had happened during the hike, and we commenced to finish our hike in the morning. The question which lingers to this day in my mind, and I would guess in the minds of many others, the question which was the reason for my contacting you in the first place, is this. Exactly who or what is capable of taking a human being many miles away, only to dismember them and put them up in a tree for safekeeping? That's what really blew my mind about this whole affair.